So the headlines have not been good for the U.S. president this weekend. In the past few hours, Donald Trump has responded to two reports containing explosive accusations against him. The latest is this one from the Washington Post. It says there are no detailed records from any of the 5 meetings Mr. Trump has had with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Post says Trump went to extraordinary lengths to keep the specifics of those conversations secret, including, on at least one occasion, confiscating the notes from the only person who'd been in the room with him. That's his interpreter, and not allowing the interpreter to discuss the meetings with anyone else in the administration.
I'm not keeping anything under wraps. I couldn't care less. I mean, it's so ridiculous. These people make it up.
This reporting comes just a day after another jaw-dropping story, this one from the New York Times. It said the FBI began a counterintelligence inquiry into Mr. Trump himself in the days after he fired FBI Director James Comey. The FBI reportedly wanted to know if the president was working to benefit Russia. Here's Mr. Trump's answer to that.
Are you now, or have you ever worked for Russia, Mr. President?
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written. And if you read the article, you'd see that they found absolutely nothing.
Members of Mr. Trump's administration are coming to their boss's defense, as you'd expect. Boris Sanchez has that part of the story from the White House.
President Trump launched a barrage of tweets on Saturday morning, responding to reporting in the New York Times that shortly after he fired former FBI Director James Comey, the FBI launched an investigation, a counterintelligence investigation, to find out whether President Trump had wittingly or unwittingly begun working for the Russian government, potentially against American interests. CNN has confirmed that that investigation was in fact opened. We should point out the president tweeted this, quote, "Wow, just learned in the failing New York Times that the corrupt former leaders of the FBI, almost all fired or forced to leave the agency for some very bad reasons, opened up an investigation on me for no reason and with no proof after I fired Lion James Comey, a total sleaze." Now, the president's own behavior after firing Comey is, according to the New York Times, what set agents off and raised red flags into the president's behavior and led to the opening of this investigation. Notably, one of those instances involved a letter that was drafted in May of 2017 before Comey was fired that listed the president's reasons for firing the now former FBI director. That letter was apparently blocked by former White House counsel Don McGahn, who threatened to resign if it was released. We know that letter is now in the possession of special counsel Robert Mueller and is part of his inquiry into whether the president committed obstruction of justice by firing James Comey. Now others are coming to the defense of the president, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who on a Sunday morning talk show called the reporting in the New York Times ludicrous. Listen to this.
I'm not going to comment on New York Times stories, but I'll certainly say this, that the notion that President Trump is a threat to American national security is absolutely ludicrous.
Just to clarify, since you were CIA director, did you have any idea that this investigation was happening?
Margaret, I've answered this question repeatedly, indeed, on your show. The idea that's contained in the New York Times story that President Trump was a threat to American national security is silly on its face and not worthy of a response.
The press secretary, Sarah Sanders, also weighed in late on Friday evening, putting out a statement that called James Comey a disgraced partisan hack and also said that the reporting in the New York Times was absurd. Boris Sanchez, CNN at the White House.
Joining me are former FBI Assistant Director Tom Fuentes and retired CIA Chief of Russia Operations Steve Hall, both of them CNN analysts. Gentlemen, glad to have you with us today. A necessity, really. Steve, let's start with you. So Mr. Trump didn't want senior administration officials knowing what he and Vladimir Putin talked about during their various meetings and conversations. Does that concern you?
Yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, having been involved in preparing seniors for these types of meetings in the past, I mean, typically the way it goes is you start out with a pre-brief with some really good experts. Fiona Hill and her team, they're inside the Trump administration with regard to Russia, have amazing expertise that they could have prepared him for. And then best case scenario, those people actually go into the meeting to participate. That sends a strong message to Vladimir Putin and the Russian side that people who really have spent their entire careers doing this are present. And then afterwards, you have a debrief. There are times I've seen it when the president or whoever the senior is says, I need to do this one-on-one, but you have to brief your team afterwards as to what happened, because it's a team sport. No one person can carry this. Donald Trump is not an expert on everything Russia, but his team is. There's only one reason that I can think of where that might not happen, and that's if Donald Trump wanted to hide something.
Isn't there an innocuous explanation to this, Steve? I'll stay with you for a second. Simply that Donald Trump doesn't follow best practice, but we know that.
Yeah, I mean, you can make the argument that he doesn't follow best practice, but in this case, if you don't follow best practice, you are not doing what is in the best interest of the United States of America. That's why those people are in the room to help. Nobody can be an expert on everything, especially something as arcane as Russia. And so you've got people to go in to help you do that. If you reject that sort of team approach, then America's interests are not served. And again, you're left wondering, why wouldn't you do that?
Tom, 24 hours ago, we found out the FBI investigated the president himself, not his allies or his campaign, Mr. Trump himself, because they were worried that he might be a threat to national security and that he might be acting on Russia's behalf. When you take the two strands of reporting this weekend, that he was hiding his conversations with Putin and that the FBI investigated him personally for national security reasons, what do you see as a whole?
Well, I think, first of all, I would agree that the idea that complex meetings with foreign leaders, you would want Team USA to be very unified in terms of the experts with the president. So, I would find that unusual, although Trump, did get burned with, it seemed like many of the things and discussions he was dealing with were immediately being leaked. You recall very early in the administration, it was reported that he had a shouting match with the Australian prime minister over taking Syrian refugees, and that immediately was reported widely. So I think that he may have gotten to the point where he just wasn't going to share this thing unless he absolutely had to, even though he should. As far as the New York Times article, I think I closely read that many, many times. And the only problem I have with that is that, what led to that investigation? Normally in the Bureau, we call that predication. What was the predication that said a case should be opened examining or investigating the president of the United States for possibly his dealings with the Russian Federation and with Putin himself? So, we don't see that. We don't see...
Well, Tom, apparently it was the reasons that the president gave for firing Jim Comey. That's what was alarming to the FBI, that he actually said this has to do with the Russian investigation. And so when they saw that, I mean, I read the same article as you. I have no further information, but when they saw that, apparently they thought, hold on, this could be against U.S. interests, and this could be actually acting in favor of Russia.
That may be true, but that and some of the other issues that were cited, I just thought that wouldn't have been in the day when I was, senior executive in the FBI. I don't know that would have been adequate to automatically say we're going to start an investigation. Now, one of the aspects of this is, and it doesn't talk about the senior official that would have approved it, this would have gone all the way to the director. And since Comey was fired, it would have gone to the deputy director, McCabe, who later was fired. So, what we heard in the Horowitz Inspector General report was that there was bias on the part of these senior officials, including McCabe and Peter Strzok and a few others, but that it didn't affect investigations. Well, if they had that bias, that might have taken a little less justification on their part to want to open a case. And, the so-called, as Strzok had put it in his text messages, the so-called insurance policy to have Trump removed. So I just think the article, to me, raised many questions, as many questions as it answered. I didn't think it answered very many.
Steve, again, I want to take everything we learned this weekend as a whole, if we can. There's just a lot of smoke. There's secrecy about conversations with Vladimir Putin, a foe of the United States. There's this FBI counterintelligence investigation. All this smoke, does it necessarily mean that there's fire somewhere, some foul play from Donald Trump? Or could it just be Trump being erratic and acting in ways we've never seen from a president before?
That's a great question, Cyril. There is a distinction between the legal parameters and the legal thresholds that have to be crossed before, say, an investigation is begun, or even before some sort of legal conclusions can be made. That's very, very different from the world that I come from, which is a counterintelligence world, which is really you're looking for patterns. There's not these legal thresholds. My assessment has always been that with this particular president, there is way too much smoke for there to be absolutely no fire. The question then simply becomes, we have already seen some of the results of the fire. We've seen guys like Michael Flynn. We've seen people like Cohen. We've seen Manafort all end up in serious, serious legal trouble, and some of them in jail. The question has always been, how far back or how far up the chain does it go? Does it get all the way to the boss? Does it get to Donald Trump? And that's what caught my attention with regard to the reporting that we got about the counterintelligence investigation that was launched by the Bureau targeting the president specifically. The other thing that I'm concerned about is, these continued patterns that we have of Donald Trump meeting with Russians, doing it in a way that is, the best thing you can say, I suppose, is unprofessional. When you're in the Oval Office talking to the Russian foreign minister, talking about, the kook, the crazy guy, meaning in this case, the former FBI director that you just fired, that's not something that you want to do in front of the Russians, just like it's not